2:14 a.m. The stratosphere above western Kansas. 38 degrees north latitude, 98 degrees west longitude. Altitude, 400 kilometers. There is no sound at 400 kilometers altitude. There is no atmosphere to carry it. There is the electromagnetic spectrum, radio waves, infrared radiation, visible light, X-rays, and there is the vacuum between them. At 2:14 a.m., a nuclear warhead detonated in that vacuum above the geographic center of the continental United States. The warhead had been delivered by an RS-28 Sarmat wire CBM, launched from Uzhur Launch Complex in Krasnoyarsk Krai, Russia, 47 minutes earlier. The Sarmat trajectory had been selected specifically to place the warhead at the desired detonation altitude and geographic position. The warhead itself was not a city-targeting high-yield device. It was a 300 kiloton device configured for the specific electromagnetic effects of a high-altitude nuclear burst rather than for blast, thermal, or fallout effects. No blast wave would reach the ground from 400 kilometers altitude. The atmosphere absorbed it entirely within the first few kilometers of descent. No thermal pulse would reach the surface with sufficient intensity to cause fires. No fallout would settle on populated areas within any operationally relevant time frame. What would reach the surface was the Compton electron cascade. A nuclear detonation at 400 kilometers altitude produces gamma radiation that travels downward through the upper atmosphere. When gamma photons interact with air molecules at altitudes between 20 and 40 kilometers, they eject electrons through Compton scattering. These electrons, moving at relativistic speeds, are deflected by the Earth magnetic field into a rotating pattern that generates an intense electromagnetic pulse, a transient electric field that can reach peak values of 50,000 volts per meter at the surface across the affected area. The affected area of a 300 kiloton burst at 400 kilometers altitude, a circle approximately 2,800 kilometers in diameter, centered on the detonation point. From western Kansas at 400 kilometers altitude, the affected circle encompassed the continental United States from the Rocky Mountains east to the Atlantic coast, from the Great Lakes south to the Gulf of Mexico. That circle contained approximately 240 million people. The majority of the U.S. military continental command and control infrastructure, and an electrical grid whose hardening against electromagnetic pulse had been the subject of congressional hearings, executive orders, and utility industry working groups for 31 years, without producing a comprehensive protection standard implemented at scale. The reason the protection standard had not been implemented at scale was cost. The cost of hardening the U.S. electrical grid against electromagnetic pulse was estimated at between billion and 0.7 billion, depending on the implementation methodology. The cost had been discussed. The implementation had not been authorized in any budget cycle since 1993. At 2:14 a.m., the decision not to spend billion became operational reality. The E1 component of the electromagnetic pulse reached the surface at the speed of light, effectively instantaneously. Its duration was approximately 10 nanoseconds. In those 10 nanoseconds, the electric field induced voltages in every conductor within the affected area. Power lines, telephone cables, vehicle electrical systems, aircraft avionics, and most critically, semiconductor electronics, whose junction voltage thresholds were measured in millivolts against an induced stress measured in thousands of volts. The E1 component primary target, not by design of any specific targeting system, but by physics, was unhardened semiconductor electronics. Modern semiconductor devices operate at voltage levels between 1.8 and 5 volts. An induced voltage of 50,000 volts per meter reaching a device through its antenna, its power lead, or its connection to external infrastructure does not damage the semiconductor in a recoverable way. It destroys the junction irreversibly. The device stops functioning. It cannot be reset or rebooted. It must be replaced. The E3 component, the slower, longer duration pulse lasting tens of seconds, induced currents in long conductors such as power transmission lines. These induced currents traveled into transformer substations, where they saturated the iron cores of large power transformers, generating heat in those cores that could damage or destroy the transformers. Large power transformers are not mass-produced items. They are custom-engineered components that take between 12 and 24 months to manufacture and deliver. The United States had approximately 2,100 large power transformers in its grid infrastructure. The number of replacement units in storage against surge demand, approximately 150. This was the strategic logic of the operation. Not the destruction of military targets. Not the attrition of weapons systems. The removal of the physical infrastructure that powered everything, military and civilian simultaneously, across a continent-sized area, for a period measured not in hours, but in months. 2:14 a.m. NORAD Cheyenne Mountain Operations Center. The RS-28 Sarmat launch had been detected by SBIRS at 1:27 a.m. The trajectory had been analyzed at 1:28 a.m. Initial assessment: ICBM launch, USR. Trajectory consistent with CONUS impact. Classification: nuclear attack warning, maximum priority. The President had been notified at 1:29 a.m. The emergency action message system had been activated. The nuclear response authorization chain had begun. At 1:31 a.m., the trajectory refinement produced a revised assessment. The Sarmat trajectory was not consistent with a CONUS surface impact. The apogee was too high. The descent phase was too steep for a standard ballistic trajectory to a ground target. The trajectory was consistent with a high-altitude burst over the central United States. High-altitude burst over CONUS. The NORAD battle commander had processed 32 exercise scenarios involving high-altitude nuclear bursts. None of them had resolved the fundamental operational ambiguity she was now processing in real time. A high-altitude burst was not the same decision set as a surface impact strike. It was not an attempt to destroy a city. It was not the opening of a strategic nuclear exchange in the traditional sense. It was something that occupied the space between a nuclear strike and a nuclear demonstration. And the U.S. response authorization chain had not been designed for that space. The GBI system at Fort Greely had been placed in emergency engagement posture at 1:29 a.m. when the initial attack warning was transmitted. At 1:31 a.m., with the revised high-altitude trajectory assessment, the engagement authorization question became complex. An SM-3 Block 2A from USS Lake Erie in the northern Pacific had a valid intercept solution against the Sarmat trajectory. The GBI engagement geometry was marginal. The authorization to engage was requested at 1:32 a.m. The authorization process ran simultaneously with the trajectory assessment refinement and the presidential notification chain. At 1:41 a.m., 23 minutes before the detonation, the President authorized engagement of the Sarmat. USS Lake Erie fired its first SM-3 Block 2A at 1:43 a.m. The Sarmat was at approximately 800 kilometers altitude on its descent arc toward the designated detonation point. The SM-3 Block 2, a operational ceiling against a target at 800 kilometers altitude, was at the outer boundary of its validated engagement envelope. Probability per shot against a Sarmat RV at that geometry, modeled at 29%. A second SM-3 was fired at 1:44 a.m. The GBI at Fort Greely fired at 1:45 a.m. from a marginal geometry that the fire control system had assessed at 18% engagement probability. 3 intercept attempts. 29%, 29%, 18%. Combined probability of at least 1 intercept, approximately 62%. The first SM-3 missed. Miss distance, 380 meters. The second SM-3 missed. Miss distance, 140 meters. The GBI intercepted the Sarmat re-entry vehicle at 1:58 a.m. at 420 kilometers altitude. The kinetic kill vehicle direct impact generated sufficient energy to fragment the re-entry vehicle. The nuclear warhead firing system was disrupted. The warhead did not achieve the designed detonation parameters. It detonated anyway. Not at 300 kilotons. Not at the designed yield. A disrupted nuclear warhead does not fail safe. It does not simply become inert. Depending on the specific weapon design and the nature of the disruption, a partially armed nuclear device can produce a yield ranging from a few tons to a few % of its designed yield. The Sarmat warhead, its firing system fragmented by the GBI kinetic impact, produced an uncontrolled detonation at approximately 400 kilometers altitude. The yield from the disrupted detonation, assessed at between 1 and 4 kilotons, not 300. The Compton electron cascade from a 1 to 4 kiloton burst at 400 kilometers altitude would produce an electromagnetic pulse of significantly reduced intensity compared to the designed 300 kiloton event, approximately 12% to 18% of the designed peak field strength, 12% to 18% of 50,000 volts per meter, 6,000 to 9,000 volts per meter. Unhardened semiconductor electronics fail at approximately 1,500 to 3,000 volts per meter, depending on device design and shielding. 6,000 to 9,000 volts per meter exceeded the failure threshold for unhardened devices across the continental United States by a factor of 2 to 3. The GBI intercept had reduced the yield by 97%. The reduced yield still exceeded the destruction threshold for civilian electronics. At 2:14 a.m., the moment of detonation, the electromagnetic pulse reached the surface. The E1 component effects were not uniform. The peak field strength of 6,000 to 9,000 volts per meter was concentrated in the area directly below the detonation point. At the edges of the affected circle, the field strength dropped to below 1,000 volts per meter, below the threshold for unhardened semiconductor failure, but sufficient to cause transient disruption in devices without adequate surge protection. In the affected high field zone, roughly the central two-thirds of the continental United States, the effects were immediate and simultaneous. Electrical grid control systems across 14 states lost their supervisory control and data acquisition systems simultaneously. The SCADA systems that managed power flow, switching, and load balancing across the grid were built on industrial computers whose hardening specifications had not included high-altitude EMP as a design parameter. Those computers failed. Without SCADA control, grid operators lost the ability to manage load balancing remotely. Substations that had automated protective relays for fault conditions activated those relays and isolated sections of the grid as the electromagnetic transients propagated through the transmission system. The cascading grid isolation that resulted was not from EMP-induced physical destruction of the transmission infrastructure. High-voltage transmission lines and their towers were largely unaffected by the E1 pulse. What failed was the intelligence layer, the sensors, computers, and communication systems that managed the grid. A grid without its intelligence layer cannot be safely operated, and operators shut down sections rather than risk uncontrolled failures. By 2:22 a.m., 8 minutes after the detonation, the power grid across the central and eastern United States had entered a cascade shutdown that had no precedent in U.S. electrical grid history. The 2003 Northeast blackout, which had affected 50 million people, had taken approximately 4 minutes to cascade from its initial fault. This cascade was faster, wider, and the cause was not a cleared transmission line, but the simultaneous failure of thousands of grid control computers. At 2:31 a.m., electrical power was unavailable across approximately 71% of the continental United States east of the Rocky Mountains. The military hardened systems, specifically engineered and protected against electromagnetic pulse effects, were largely operational. The command networks inside Cheyenne Mountain were functional. The nuclear C3 infrastructure was functional. The hardened communications links between military command authorities were functional. The Ohio-class submarines at sea were unaffected. The ICBM silos were hardened. The nuclear deterrent was intact. What was not intact was the physical infrastructure that supported military operations in ways not directly related to nuclear deterrence. The commercial electrical grid that powered most U.S. military bases in the continental United States was offline. Backup generators at hardened facilities activated automatically. But backup generators at non-hardened facilities, including many support functions, logistics nodes, and communications relay infrastructure that was military in designation but commercial in its power infrastructure, were dependent on the commercial grid. The fuel supply chain for those backup generators was also dependent on the commercial electrical grid. Fuel pumps do not operate without electricity. The civilian emergency response infrastructure, hospitals, water treatment facilities, communications networks, was operating on whatever backup power was available and functional. The U.S. civilian infrastructure backup power had been designed for hours-long outages, not for an event whose restoration timeline was measured in months. This was the operational calculation that had motivated the weapon design and employment, not the destruction of military targets. The removal of the physical environment within which the military operated, the economy functioned, and the population survived. 3:19 a.m. Cheyenne Mountain Operations Center. The NORAD battle commander had been processing the engagement sequence, the detonation assessment, and the civilian infrastructure impact reports simultaneously since 2:14 a.m. Her command systems were operational. Her communications with Strategic Command, Pacific Command, and European Command were functional, the civilian impact picture being assembled at 3:19 a.m. 71% of the continental eastern U.S. without commercial grid power. Emergency services in 23 states operating on backup power of varying reliability. Hospital emergency generators running. Water treatment plants in 37 major metropolitan areas operating on backup or partially offline. Commercial telecommunications. Mobile networks partially offline in the high field zone as cell towers' battery backups depleted after approximately 4 hours of operation without commercial power. The military was operational. The society it defended was in the largest peacetime infrastructure disruption in U.S. history. The President had been in continuous contact with NORAD, Strategic Command, and the National Security Council since 1:29 a.m. The U.S. nuclear response decision had been processed through the authorization chain and had produced a decision not to employ nuclear weapons in response. The GBI intercept had reduced the yield. The detonation had been uncontrolled rather than the designed 300 kiloton event, and the intelligence assessment had determined the operation was a demonstration of capability designed to impose infrastructure costs rather than an attempt to initiate strategic nuclear exchange. That assessment was being debated. The weapon had detonated in U.S. airspace. Its nuclear yield, though reduced, had impacted U.S. territory infrastructure. Whether an uncontrolled nuclear detonation over Kansas constituted a nuclear strike requiring nuclear response was the question the NSC Legal and Strategic Review was processing at 3:19 a.m. The President had not authorized nuclear employment. The review was ongoing. The Russian government had transmitted a communication through the Nuclear Crisis Hotline at 2:18 a.m., 4 minutes after the detonation. The communication had defined the operation as a proportionate response to U.S. military actions in the Western Pacific, had asserted that the GBI intercept had violated the Outer Space Treaty provisions governing military activities in space, and had stated that the Russian government considered the matter settled, pending the cessation of U.S. military activities in the Western Pacific that had motivated the action. The U.S. position on the Outer Space Treaty question, the proportionality framing, and the demand regarding Western Pacific operations was being formulated. None of it would restore power to 71% of the continental United States before the backup generators in the affected area began running out of fuel. The fuel logistics problem was being coordinated between FEMA, the Defense Logistics Agency, and the National Guard chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear emergency support units whose equipment was EMP hardened and whose vehicles could operate in the post-pulse environment. The legal question, whether a weapon launched by Russia, intercepted by the US, and detonated in an uncontrolled manner at 400 kilometers altitude, constituted a nuclear attack authorizing nuclear response, had no clear precedent. The 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, and the established doctrine of nuclear deterrence had all been constructed around the assumption that nuclear weapons were either employed against surface targets or not employed at all. A high-altitude EMP warhead intercepted mid-flight and detonated unintentionally at reduced yield was not a category that any of those frameworks had explicitly addressed. The Russian communication had anticipated this ambiguity. Its framing of the operation as a proportionate response to US military actions, combined with its assertion that the GBI intercept itself was the violation that had produced the uncontrolled detonation, was designed to insert a degree of legal and moral complexity into the US response decision that would slow the authorization process. The communication had been drafted by legal analysts in the Russian Foreign Ministry who had spent 11 months on exactly this framing. It had arrived 4 minutes before impact. 4 minutes was not sufficient time to resolve the legal question it raised. It was sufficient time to introduce it into the decision process at the moment when the detonation was unavoidable, and the response decision was the only remaining choice. The proportionate, non-nuclear military response that the Joint Chiefs were developing at 3:19 a.m. would address the Russian naval and air assets that had supported the Sarmat launch operation, the early warning and targeting aircraft, the naval vessels that had provided the over-the-horizon radar coverage of the trajectory. Those responses did not require nuclear authorization. They required conventional military authorization that the President could grant under the existing war powers framework. That framework was intact. The command authority was intact. The authorization chain was intact. The lights in 71% of the eastern United States were not intact. The proportionate response planning continued. Time from Sarmat launch detection to presidential authorization to engage, 14 minutes. Time from presidential authorization to GBI intercept, 13 minutes. Time from GBI intercept to detonation, 16 minutes. Time from detonation to 71% grid offline, 8 minutes. Russian systems employed: 1 RS-28 Sarmat 1 CBM with 1 modified 300 kiloton high-altitude EMP warhead, altitude placement trajectory over central conus. U.S. intercept results: USS Lake Erie, SM-3 Block 2A. 2 launches, both missed, 380 meters and 140 meters. Fort Greely, GBI, 1 launch, kinetic intercept achieved at 420 kilometers altitude. Warhead disrupted. Uncontrolled detonation at 1 to 4 kilotons versus designed 300 kilotons. Yield reduction, 97%. EMP effects: E1 peak field strength, 6,000 to 9,000 volts per meter in high field zone, reducing below 1,000 volts per meter at margins. Continental U.S. grid control SCADA systems in high field zone, failed. Grid cascade: 71% of continental eastern U.S. without commercial power by 2:22 a.m. Military hardened systems, fully operational. Nuclear deterrent, fully operational and intact. Civilian infrastructure: hospitals on backup generators, estimated 4 to 12-hour fuel endurance in affected areas. Water treatment, partial operation. Mobile telecommunications, operational for estimated 4 hours, then degrading as tower batteries deplete. Large power transformer damage assessment ongoing. GBI intercept cost, $4 million. Yield reduction, 97%. Effect achieved despite intercept. EMP field above civilian electronics failure threshold maintained. The system had performed. The GBI had achieved its intercept. The yield had been reduced by 97%. The 3% that remained had still exceeded the failure threshold for unhardened electronics across 71% of the continental United States. The hardening program discussed, evaluated, and not funded for 31 years, had a cost of $2.7 billion. The cost of restoring grid infrastructure, replacing damaged transformers, and managing the civilian emergency operations now underway across the eastern United States was not yet calculable. The billion decision had been before Congress 31 times since 1993. It was before them again. This time, the lights were off.